Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello guys, we are from group 5. We would like to explain about experimental designs on Creswell Chapter 10. Before we start the presentation, I would like to introduce our member. The first is Afifah, and the second one is me, Mikdad Abdulaziz Azaki, and the last one is Rahmania. Okay, for the first presenter is Afifah. The chance is yours.
Hel- Hello everyone, let me introduce myself. My name is Atifa as a first speaker. Now, I want to explain about the definition of experimental design. An experimental design is the traditional approach to conducting quantitative research. Experimental design is a research conducted with a scientific approach using two sets of variables. The first set acts as a constant, which you use to measure the differences of the second set. If you don't have enough data to support your decisions, you must first determine the facts. Experimental research gathers the data necessary to help you make better decisions. Next, uh, when to use an experiment? You use an experiment when you want to establish possible cause and effect between your independent and dependent variables. This means that you attempt to control all variables that influence the outcome except for the independent variable. Then, when the independent variable influences the dependent variable, we can say the independent variable cause and probably cause the dependent variable. Because experiments are controlled, they are the best of quantitative design to use to establish probable cause and effect. Next, how it developed. The ideas used in experiment today were mostly in place by the first few decades of the 20th century. The procedures of comparing groups, assigning individuals to treatments, and statistically analyzing groups comparison had been developed by 1940. During the 1960s, the types of experimental design were identified and the strength of this design specified by 1980. Since 1990, computers improved the statistical procedures, and more complex designs have advanced experimental research. Before you consider how to conduct an experiment, you will find it helpful to understand in more depth several key ideas central to experimental research. The first characteristic of experimental research is random assignment. After developing an appropriate sampling method, a researcher needs to randomly assign individuals to the different group of the study. One of the main reasons for doing this is to remove the bias of individual differences in all groups of the study. For example, if you are doing a study on intelligence, you want to make sure that all groups have the same characteristic of intelligence. This helps for the groups to equal or to be the same. This prevents people from saying the reason there are differences between groups is because the groups are different and not because of treatment. And the second characteristic is control over extraneous variables. Random assignment directly leads to the concern of controlling extraneous variables. The definition of extraneous variables are any factors that might influence the cause and effect relationship that you are trying to establish. These other factors confound and or confuse the result of a study. There are several methods for dealing with this as shown below. The first is pre-test post-test. Pre-test post-test allows a researcher to compare the measurement of something before the treatment and after the treatment. The assumption is that any difference in the scores of before and after is due to the treatment. During the test takes into account the confounding of the different context of the setting and individual characteristic. The next is homogeneous sampling. This approach involves selecting people who are highly similar on the particular trait that is being measured. This removes the problem of individual differences when attempting to interpret the result. The more similar the subjects in the sample are, the more controlled the traits of the people are controlled for. The next is covariate. Covariate is a statistical approach in which controls are placed on the dependent variable through statistical analysis. The influence of other variables are removed from the explained variance of the dependent variable. Covariate helps to explain more about the relationship between the independent and dependent variables. This is a difficult concept to understand. However, the point is that you use covariate to explain in greater detail the relationship between the independent and dependent variable by removing other variables that might explain the relationship. The next is matching for participants. Matching is deliberate rather than randomly assigning subjects to various groups. For example, if you're looking at intelligence, you might match high achievers in both groups of the study. By placing high achievers in both groups, you cancel out their difference. And last, blocking variables. One such procedure is to block for grade level before the experiment begins. A blocking variable is a variable the researcher controls before the experiment starts by dividing the participant into subgroups and analyzing the impact of each subgroup on the outcome. And the third characteristic of experimental research is manipulation manipulation of the treatment condition. Uh, Once you select the participant, you randomly assign them to either a treatment condition or at the experimental group. In experimental treatment, the researcher physically intervenes to alter the condition experienced by the experimental unit. Uh, In general, whenever there is a relationship between two variables, a researcher can use manipulation to determine which variables is the cause and which is the effect. And the next characteristic is outcome measure. In all experiment situations, you assess whether a treatment condition influences an outcome or dependent variables, such as a reduced rate of smoking or achievement on tests. In experiment, the outcome is the dependent variable that is the presumed effect of treatment variable. It is also the effect predicted in a hypothesis in cause and effect equation. Good outcome measures are sensitive to treatments in that they respond to the smallest amount of intervention. Outcome measures also need to be valid so that experimental researchers can draw valid inferences from them. The next is group comparisons. Group comparison. In an experiment, we also compare scores for different treatments on an outcome. A group comparison is the process of a researcher obtaining scores for individuals or groups on the dependent variable and comparing the means and variance both within the group and between the groups. And the last characteristic is threats to validity. Validity is crucial to any research as it focuses on how well we have measured what we intended to measure. Due to the importance of validity of experimental research, we should be aware of what could compromise it. There are two main categories of validity that are concerned with threats to research. They are internal and external validity. Threats to internal validity. This is most concerned with strength and control of research design and its ability to determine causal relationship between independent and dependent variables. There are several factors that can become threat to internal validity. The first is history. Events that occur between measurement of an experiment have an effect on results of a treatment. The next is maturation. When subjects change over the course of an experiment due to the passage of time such as fatigue or development. And the next is regression. Regression to the mean is caused by selecting participants for research based on their extreme characteristics. Next is subject selection. Differences between individuals in each group can be responsible for results on a test of IQ. Those with higher IQs pretest may be allocated to one group than another, causing a relationship between the test and IQ score when there is already a bias. Next is morality. Participants withdrawn from the study can distort results. Participants dropping out of a motivation study will leave those more motivated to live in the study. Next is instrumentation. Change in the measuring instrument or observed over time, a piece of equipment may be affected by wear over time, resulting in poor accuracy in measurement. And the last is repeated testing. One test can have an effect on taking a second test, uh, like learning a strategy to a puzzle in one test will improve performance in the future. Um, Next, threat to external validity. Threat to external validity is the extent that an experiment can be generalized to the wider world. A study with strong external validity can be replicated without any major differences. Threat to external validity can create significant results during an experiment. Okay, thank you. Uh, this is my part, and will be and for the next presentation will be delivered by my friends. Thank you.
Okay, now we come to the types of experimental research. So, there are two categories here. First is between group design, and second is within group or individual design. In between group design, there are three types. First is through experiment, Second is quasi-experiment, and the last is factorial design. Whereas in within group or individual design, there are three. First is time series, second is repeated measures experiment, and last is single subject experiment. It is stated by Creswell 2013, and we will discuss in detail in next slides. Those types will be differentiated by this characteristic. First is the random assignment of participants group. Second is the number of groups or individuals being compared. The third is the number of interventions used by the researcher. And the fourth is the number of times the dependent variable is measured. And the last is the control of extraneous variables. Then we come to the explanation in detail. Here is between group design. As I told before, that there are three types. First is through experiments. It is when the researcher randomly assigns participants to different conditions of the experimental variable. So, the individual in the experimental group receive the experimental treatment, whereas those in the control group do not. Then, quasi-experiments it is when the researchers need to use intake group because of the availability of participants or because the setting prohibits forming artificial group. So, this is include assignment but not random assignment of participants to group. And the last is factorial design. It is a modification of between group design in which the researcher studies two or more categorical independent variables, each examined at two or more levels. So this study aims to the study in the independent and simultaneous effect of two or more independent treatment variables on an outcome. So those all about between group design, and we come to within or individual group design. First is time series. Time series. It is a design consists of studying one group over time with multiple pre-tests and post-tests measures by researcher. So this design does not require access to large numbers of participants, one group study only. Then the second type is repeated measures. So it is when the researcher compares a group performance under one experimental with experimental treatment with its performance under another experimental. So all participants in a single group participate in all experimental treatments. And the last is single subject design. So the study of single individuals in observation over a baseline period and the administration of an intervention. So this is followed by another observation after the intervention to determine if the treatment affects the outcome. So those all about the types of experimental research. And now we come to the ethical issues in experimental research. What does ethical issues mean? It means it relates to with the ethics of withholding treatments from individuals in control groups when these individuals might be disadvantaged by not receiving the beneficial treatment. So we have to see this underlined that individuals might be disadvantaged by not receiving the beneficial treatment. So we can conduct these steps. First is giving treatments after the experiment concludes. Second is giving all participants some levels of beneficial treatment. The third is offering the beneficial treatment to the control group after the experiment concludes. And the last is need to understand cause and effect in order to determine the best course of action, and that randomization is preferred to other ways of addressing causality. So this Studied by Mark and Gamble 2009.
Okay, I would like to explain about steps in conducting an experiment. The first is step 1. Decide if an experiment addresses your research problem. The type of issues studied by experimenters is the need to know whether a new practice influences an outcome. Step 2. Form hypotheses to test cause and effect relationship. When stating experimental hypotheses, follow this guideline. The first independent variable should contain at least one variable with multiple levels, and the researchers need to manipulate one of the levels. Second, variables are measured on instrument or recorded as observation. Okay, step 3. Select an experimental unit and identify study participants. An experimental unit of analysis is the smallest unit treated by the researcher during an experiment. It should consider this aspect. First, who will participate in your experiment? And the second, how many people will you study? And the third, how should the participants be chosen? And the last is, how should the individuals be assigned to the groups? And then next, step 4, select an experimental treatment and introduce it. The key to any experimental design is to set levels of treatment and apply one level to each group, such as one level to an experimental group and another level to a control group. Step 5. Choose a type of experimental design. One aspect of preparing for the experiment is choosing the design and providing a visual diagram of it. You need to make several decisions based on your experience with experiment, the availability of participants for the study, and your ability to practically control for extraneous influences in the project before choosing a design. And the step 6, conduct the experiment. Conducting the experiment involves procedural steps consistent with the design selected. It may involve the first, administering a pretest, if you plan to use one. The second is introducing the experimental treatment to be the experimental group or relevant group, and monitoring the process closely so that the threat to internal validity are minimized. The fourth, gathering post-test measures, the outcome of or dependent variable measures. And the last is using ethical practices by debriefing the participants by informing them of the purpose and reason for the experiment, such as asking them what they thought what was occurring. It's from Newman 2000. Step 7. Organize and analyze the data. Three major activities are required at the conclusion of the experiment. The first is coding the data, the second one is analyzing the data, and the last is writing the experimental report. And step 8, develop an experimental research report. The experimental report follows a standard format. In the methods or procedures section of an experiment, the researchers typically includes information about participants and their assignment, the experimental design, the intervention and materials, control over extraneous variable, and the last is dependent measures or observation. Okay, the last is I would like to tell you about evaluating experimental research. The key characteristic and the procedures form a basis for evaluating an experimental study. For a good experiment, here are some criteria. The first, the experiment has a powerful intervention. The second, the treatment groups are few in number. And the third, participants will gain from the intervention. The fourth, the researcher derives the number of participants per group in some systematic way. And the fifth, an adequate number of participants were used in the study. Six, the researcher used measures and observations that are valid, reliable, and sensitive. And the seven is the researcher control for extraneous factor that might influence the outcome. And the last is the researcher addresses threat to internal and external validity. It based on Bausel 1994. Okay, that's all the presentation. Thank you for your attention.